Hey everybody, so we have now rounded the corner on our final session, and I've asked Lam and Edicio and John Keefe to join me up here, and we're going to have a bit of a chat. We're going to now migrate to the exciting couch part of the day. Where do you want us? Sit anywhere. Sit anywhere. Somebody bring your water. Somebody bring your water. So as we get set up, I just wanted to review some of what have been some of my favorite highlights of a really incredible day. I loved how, Lam, in the beginning of the day, you started off, explain how your work is often play. What a great, are we too close? I can scoot over one. All right, we're cozy. We're cozy. Yeah. And then John, you know, how you talked about, you showed us very firsthand that when the audience is involved in creating a story, you have their attention. I think we were all fixated by your live room experiments with us. In the breakout sessions we had in this room, you know, many thanks to Linda Pullman, who proved that print is not dead, and the pleasures and heartaches of book-length reporting, to Edicio, who showed us a glimpse of the future in 360 video that was absolutely captivating, to Kat Chow, who told us about how great stories exist in these uncomfortable spaces, especially when we're talking about topics like race and diversity, that going to those places of discomfort is a real richness and source of stories. And then, of course, Julie, who introduced the word podgeist to us and showed us where some of the hot zones and cold spots are in this burgeoning new world of podcasting. It's just been a tremendous day, and I thank you all and all of our speakers for being here today. So what we want to do now is spend our last little bit of time together going over some really practical advice from people you've all tried new things, you've all migrated in your careers and done different things. And I really wanted to start out kind of with the question of, what was the moment you first tried something totally different that you'd never done before, where you got out of your comfort zone and were willing to experiment with something you were in over your head on? John, you want to start?
Sure. I think when I decided to experiment, it's actually an interesting question and you let me know about this question beforehand, which was very kind of you.
I cheated.
It actually happened when, and this may come as a shock to y'all, when I watched a guy on stage text everybody in the audience using code that he was writing on stage. So that was not an original trick. Although I don't think I've seen it happen since then. It was a gentleman from the company that runs that API that I use to do that. I saw him do this. This was probably 6 years ago. And he was from the company that did it. And he was actually a coder. I later taught myself. But I sat in the audience, much like yourselves, and I said to the guy next to me, who I knew and who was from ProPublica, still there, Al Shaw, at ProPublica, which is an investigative news site, and he is a reporter programmer at that site. And I said, I want to do that. I know it's possible. You can do that. I want to do that. And he said, you can. And here's how. And he said, learn the language Ruby. Actually, a version of Ruby. This is a programming language called Sinatra. He said, it's almost like writing in English, and you can make things work that way. And I took him up on it, and I started learning about it. And that I can do that now, 6 years later on this stand, is because I just said, I want to do that. And he said, you can. So I think that I would take that lesson and say, you can do this stuff, all of this stuff too.
Mm-hmm. Well, now you were trained in Flash, right, at Columbia, you said, right?
Yes.
And at what point did you break past the barriers of Flash and try something you'd never done before?
Well, first I went from Flash to... Every time I have a new job, people seem to think that I know how to do certain things. So I have to make it up as I go along. Again, like this speech was founded in reality in many ways. The first time I came to Planet Money, they were like, oh, you know how to do infographics, right? And I was like, I did a 6-week kind of quick course of it. And they're like, sure. And then a lot of it was just kind of like learning how to look at spreadsheets and learning how to do like simple formulas in spreadsheets. And I think I accidentally published the wrong sheet of data. So I did projections of like an infographic projected data versus like actual data, which was not very good. And then my editor ran up and was like, "You're wrong." And I was like, "Okay." And then I had to change the chart, and there was a correction, and that kind of stuff just happens. But yeah, then afterwards I was able to like figure out, okay, there are ways of doing data in a very good and conscientious way. There are checking mechanisms and stuff like that. And so experimentation also takes like a lot of like learning from other people, tweeting at people and being like, okay, how do I do this? And so on. Yeah, there was a lot of throwing me in the cold water from job to job over and over again.
And just learning as you did it.
Yeah.
Nice.
All the time.
So I would say the first time I made my first website for weather.com was probably a terrifying experience because I was the only one doing it. The featured websites and documentary stuff was not something that the product team had in their roadmap. And by roadmap, I mean they weren't going to do it. So my boss gave me the opportunity to learn, at this 3-month course. But you don't learn how to do everything in 3 months, and so a lot of it was just trial and error and trying to figure things out and trying to do things that I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to. So it was out of my comfort zone completely. And building a website is not as it's just there's so many moving parts, and one of the big things that I didn't know was security, right? It was keeping your website from getting attacked or the DDoS attacked or anything like that, and that was something that just went over my head. And the moment I published my first website, it was, it was shutting down. I was just like, I don't know what to do, So that's when I actually learned to just start tagging people and helping me, and that's really was my first big scary moment.
So I'm hearing a common theme that there was some degree of risk with all of you in trying these new things out, and possibly some degree of failure and a lot of reaching out for help. Are there other notable kind of big failures, maybe John or Lam, that you've experienced that you could give the benefit of your failure wisdom to this fine audience?
All right. One of the first videos I did was for a series called What's in Your Wallet? And it was with this guy who was like kind of like a CTO or a CEO, really far up in a company. And he showed us his wallet, and he showed us his credit card on the video. And I didn't blur it out, which was great. And then I got into so much trouble. I was like, holy crap, and I had to take down a video. Another time, at like 4 o'clock in the morning, we were trying to launch an app with a colleague. And we were like playing around with like, okay, how do we change permissions to a domain? We have this specific subdomain, I'm going to keep the news organization out, .com. For scroll stories on like special projects. And for I think 2 hours or 3 hours between the hours of like 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., we we destroyed the website. It was great. But those are great failures, and we panicked. And then I think when we got things working at like 5 o'clock in the morning, we did a little dance, and then we mined about it. It was great. Did a little mine about it.
So you recovered. John?
Some of the failures. I think one of the things that happens, so a lot of these tools and a lot of these things that you can do, it puts power in your hands that experts who've been doing these things for a long time will basically you're doing something a little bit without a license, right? Like mapping things without a license. And actually, I showed a map to the workshops yesterday about stop and frisk and guns. And it's actually so stop and frisk is the practice that has been practiced in New York City for a while about stopping people on the street and frisking them for very little cause.
The police do this, not just average citizens.
Police, sorry. Yeah, this is not just something we do to each other, right? It'd be a whole other story. And we looked at where the police had said that it was the big benefit of doing this practice is to get guns off the street. So we actually mapped both where stop and frisks happened and where the guns were picked up. And very factually, it's the number of guns are minuscule compared to the number of stop and frisks at this time when this was happening and we were talking about it. And so I made a map about it. It's a very powerful map. It got a lot of attention. And while I was on Christmas vacation, somebody his name is Steve Romalewski at the CUNY Graduate Center, wrote a long, detailed blog post about why my map was wrong and all of the problems with my map. And we still, to this day, we have some differing opinions about that map, but he's trained as a cartographer. He's amazing at it. And he called me out on some very key points there are mistakes that I haven't made again, including making sure that you map rates, not raw numbers. So it's not just the number of stops in a particular block, but how many also people live in that block. And so to map rates and not raw numbers is the biggest thing that I learned from that. And my reaction, I was like, I can't believe this. This is failure to success, I think. So I couldn't figure out what my best response was, except that I wrote him an email and said, I think we need to have coffee. And we sat down, and I thought this was going to be a very contentious half hour. And it ended up being 2 hours of an amazing conversation about what I was doing, what he was doing, and how we might work together. We're working together with him right now. He's an amazing mapper and civic-minded data person, and I'm lucky to have him as a friend and colleague. So that was my failure to success. But it hurt.
That seems like a great failure to have. And it actually reminds me of something I think is a little bit different in this kind of digital frontier of storytelling. I know that, traditional newspapers, for example, are very competitive. You would never call up your competitor writer across town and compare notes and go out for coffee. But it seems like all of you have been able to reach out to people online and form relationships where you're learning from people that used to be considered competitors. How does that work? Should we all do that, or is that a mistake? Or is everyone friendly? Do some people shut you down and say, no, this is my private thing?
So for when I was making websites, that was actually probably the first thing I did. I contacted people who were way smarter than me and have done beautiful things online. So, the sense of competition, I guess it's always there, but the collaborative work is probably more powerful than the competition. I think also when you meet these people face to face, they see your passion, they see that you're not just some schmo, that's just trying to copy their work or do stuff. And also when you pay them, it also works too. But in reality, I think especially in the development world, collaboration is key. Everything is open source. There really isn't an idea that you own X, Y, or Z. It's more that you can adapt X, Y to A, B, and C. So yeah, I think that's what I have to say.
So as a coder, or basically, I keep on telling my friends that every time I choose a profession, it seems to be a sausage fest. And I'm like one of the few women in the room.
Do people know what that means?
Sausage fest, is that a word you have? All guys in a room.
Yeah, and coding is a very male-dominated sort of world oftentimes, although we're trying to change that. And it can seem a little unfriendly, because a lot of people are like, I know how to do this, and look at my code. But there's also spaces where you can find that collaborative feel, and they're great. There are a lot, for as many a-holes as there are out there, there are also quite a few really helpful, lovely people out there who will walk you through their code. John is one of them. John's employee is one of them. Noah Veltman. There are a lot of people who want to share this, and there's also really supportive groups now, in particular for people who feel really intimidated about this and feel like it's not often a welcome space. I think Kat was talking about what it's like when you're the only person in a room who looks a certain way, and the only person who's doing coding who's maybe a woman of color and who's very engaged when it comes to social justice issues. And then you find spaces like Black Women Who Code, which is an organization that helps Black women to code. And then there's within each Slack channel that is centered around being a coding space for news developers. There's also a women's little channel and so on. And you find spaces where you can find the kind of help and the kind of understanding and empathy that you need to get to this, because coding, oh gosh, there are always all of these problems that you encounter, and you're always racking your head about why this break, why does it not work somewhere, and having a sounding board, finding people that you could trust within different channels and within different communities is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the people who work in technology and in coding and other things in journalism come from the open source community, or at least really buy into open source, which is putting things, putting your work online, making it available for free, usually, under a very liberal license, and sharing and building off of each other, which is amazing if you think about it in terms of journalism, right? As you're saying, this is a very competitive field. So here we are helping each other compete against us, which is kind of awesome. And also, it doesn't extend necessarily to the ideas and the investigation. So I might, actually in some cases I do collaborate with other organizations, but I might not reveal that I'm working on a particular project, especially if it's not my project, right? If we're investigating something, we want to be the first to reveal that. But once we do that project, if we did any coding or anything else behind that, we'll share all of that. Not only, so it's sort of a show your work mentality, and it's also really good for journalism and storytelling because it approaches the sort of reproducibility question, right? So if we show not only how we got, not only what we did, but the data behind it, and we share that data if we've cleaned it up or have done it. And now we're moving to a point where we're actually making it so you can analyze the data the way we did, which is another step in being sort of open source about it. And then if we screw up, and sometimes we do, people can catch it and we can be more accurate.
So there's been a scary word mentioned a lot right now recently, which is coding. And I would imagine most of the people in the room, how many people have like played with code at all or touched it, right? Okay, so that's a really lovely number. There are also a lot of people who haven't. I want to put forward a challenging statement. I have a point of view. You all may have a different point of view. The question always gets asked in conversations like this, should everyone learn how to code? My personal point of view has always been, I've never needed to, but I have needed to learn how to talk to coders, how to have good, clear communication so I can collaborate. That I'm bringing something to the table, they're bringing something to the table, and we build something together. But I know some people feel differently and feel that everyone should learn how to code. Your thoughts, team?
I kind of agree with this, that idea. When I first came into the Weather Channel, I did not know how to code. And that's when I took those classes. I learned as much as I could. And, I guess when you start creating collaborative work with other people who are smarter than you or know what they're doing, it's actually very relieving. And that's when your web developer becomes your storytelling partner. And, to make a long story short, it's like when you have someone who is just a stellar storyteller, and then you have someone who can translate what that person has to do onto the web perfectly. It's almost very useful for that person to know, the limitations, what CSS is, what HTML is, what HTML5 is, why this doesn't work on your phone, and why this works on a tablet. So it's more of just the awareness that I think is super important. You don't need to know a lick of CSS or JavaScript. JavaScript is incredibly hard to catch on, but HTML and CSS are not. They're just intimidating. And I encourage actually everyone who didn't raise their hand to go to codeacademy.com and just practice, and do some things some exercises that are just very simple to do. One of the first practices that I did when I was learning JavaScript was I learned how to make a rock, paper, scissors video game. And it sounds silly, but you learn the logic of what a robot or what a machine needs to understand to think to make something like that. So I think it's a little bit of both. If you come in with that knowledge, you're ahead of the game. But if you don't, you at least have to respect it, understand it, and know the limitations.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between knowing how to code and having code literacy. Yeah. Because I think, again, being able to communicate in a collaborative environment is very important. And really, it takes a lot of dedication, passion, and a knack for something that to develop coding skills at a level where you can make a data visualization. Mm. It's not everyone's cup of tea. There are developers who will regularly stay up until 3 a.m. because they're so enticed by what they're doing, and they find the payoff of having a functioning, beautiful data visualization enough to actually keep doing that. And they enjoy the puzzle solving, the process of coding, the process of figuring out one large problem, which is making this data visualization one small problem at a time. And if you are not by nature that kind of person who wants to do that, then I don't think you need to learn how to code. And coding is also like this mega term that like involves a lot of different types of code. Yeah. As I said before, like I think CSS, HTML, and JavaScript are the building blocks of a website. So that might be something that you want to be learning. HTML is like the content. CSS makes it look a certain way and gives it styles. And JavaScript acts into action and into activity in general. And then there are other languages that can be useful in different ways for journalism, which include Python or Ruby, which are there for you to scrape, to gather data, to report, and to process stuff.
So, go ahead, Jim.
Could I just
real
jump
quick,
in
yeah.
real quick?
Sure.
I'll just say that no, you don't need to know how to code. You also don't need to know how to take pictures. You also don't need to know how to do videos. But if you do, that may make you more valuable. And I'll just add one other thing about this issue of numeracy and data. We often think, oh, we're writers and storytellers, we don't do math. But your sources are ahead of you. The police are ahead of you. The companies are ahead of you. The politicians are ahead of you. The nonprofits are ahead of you. They're all using data and math. And at least we need to understand what they're doing. And the more that you work with it, the more you can ask good questions. And I just add that.
That's a great point. So to go completely away from the question of coding, what about the flip side? What about the future of text or print? What do you guys think that the role is for one of our oldest forms of storytelling in our digital age?
I think there's a difference between print and then there's
Fair
a
enough.
difference between text, right?
Yep. That's why I said both.
I think text is still one of the fastest traveling media out there. And it can be very efficient in breaking news situations, for example. Sometimes you can write a tweet much faster than you can get a camera into a news location and stuff like that. I think there's also a renaissance in long form if you think about it. But I think what you were talking about a while back at a different talk in terms of Upworthy is like the attention management throughout how we write and what we bring through the writing is changing. Like there is much more of a need for authors to have a voice these days, right? You will know names like Jenna Wortham, who's a writer for New York Times Magazine, because of her style, because of her voice, because of her approach to storytelling, rather than just know them because you went to the NewYorkTimes.com, because very few people still do that, right? And so I think it's a lot more about understanding how to use text, what it's good at, and then doing it with a unique angle and with a unique like subject area expertise than it is about like one thing dying and the other thing like emerging, right?
I think I'll just address the print part. And this is coming from a radio guy who does online things, so you can take that as you will. I think the proposition of mass market printing words and pictures on trees and figuring out a way to move them around the country or the city is a losing proposition. I really do. I think it's not sustainable. I don't know that it's even economically sustainable. And just having watched this industry for many years, it's not improving. So I don't see a very long, successful future for that action.
Controversial statement about the death of tree-based media. I would like to put a vote in that I disagree respectfully for that, just because one of the things that's been really interesting to watch when we talk about attention is a lot of studies have shown that people retain information and stories much better from a print source than like a Kindle or an e-reader or a computer or a phone. Part of it is that part of your brain is not having to do this extra work of figuring out the interface, so you can spend all your brain on absorbing the text. So I keep all my books. I have a ton of books. I get print subscriptions, and I think they're going to stick around, so we can make a bet on that. So one or two more questions before we wrap up. How much do each of you think about your audience before you start a story? Is that for a millisecond? Is it for a half a day? How intensively do you think about reaching out to the audience when you start?
So I would say that's the first thing we do. At least at weather.com, and when I worked at CBS News, it was the same thing. Audience engagement is 100% part of your job as a journalist, and to know statistics like from Adobe Omniture and from Google Analytics and other maybe proprietary systems that are in your own CMS, this information is incredibly valuable to you because you know what promos work, what headlines work, what promotional images work, and to not understand that and to not appreciate it, you're just not going to understand why your story didn't do well, and you're not going to understand why your story did well. So to me, A/B testing is 100% a part of the new world of journalism.
I think it's, one of the most, at the beginning of the story, you have to think about who you're telling it to. Because nowadays, having a general audience is not necessarily a viable business strategy anymore. You kind of want to figure out whether you are targeting various niche audiences the way BuzzFeed does, or whether you have a better idea of who your audience member is. There's a lovely methodology in software development that might be helpful, which is called developing a user story. Find a biography of a typical audience member that you think you are trying to reach, write out like how they consume news, what kind of information they would want, and seriously, that helps you shape the story. It helps you build around that specific persona, and it helps you tell the story in a way that makes it most accessible to them.
100% of the time. We're always thinking about the audience from start to finish. I think doing anything else is problematic for a lot of reasons, and that not only includes the demographics and the geography, but in our case, we're doing a lot of thinking about, do you understand the visual? Do you understand it from a cultural perspective? What audiences are going to understand that? How do you know what this button means? Like, we're trying to figure those things out. I think that also becomes a really interesting issue when you're thinking about expanding your audience. So that becomes a very careful move, and I think it has to be deliberate. But in general, like if we're thinking about what we're doing tomorrow, it's absolutely about our audience.
So I don't want to keep you all from drinks, but I have one more very quick question to hopefully end on a high and happy note. I'd love to hear what was the best piece of advice you got as a storyteller. And, as an example, one that stuck with me for a long time, when I was an intern working for Ira Glass at This American Life, he used to say, you usually have some favorite bit of the story that you found. And if you can find a way to sneak it in there every day, you've won for the day. And I've always kept that with me, because sometimes your favorite part of the story is not really relevant. Sometimes your favorite part of the story is maybe a little quirky. But the game and the puzzle of figuring out how to slip in the thing I really loved into a thing an audience might really love proved to be a consistent challenge that just kept me thinking fresh every day.
I think the best piece of advice that I got was from a guy named Colin Campbell, who works in California in public radio. And he said, you should have, hello. You should have, I know this is going to sound silly, but he's like, you should have a blog. I was like, what? He's like, no, you should have a blog. It doesn't matter if anybody ever reads it. You should have a blog, and you should post the things that you're doing and the things that you're thinking about on the blog, and just get used to doing that and putting your ideas out there, writing about them, and trying to share them with others. And even if it's just your mom who reads it, do that. Somebody else had also said, make sure you get a URL with your name in it, if you can do that.
So that's johnkeefe.net.
And oddly, and I'm sure that it's my mom and maybe 6 other people who look at this blog, except that one of them happened to be a book editor, and now I'm writing a book that's coming out in October. So sometimes that works, but that wasn't why it worked for me. What worked for me was the practice of putting my stuff out there and kind of forcing myself to do that really helped my storytelling ability, my crafting ability, and just my exploration of life.
So for me, I would have to probably quote my boss of 7 years, Kevin Hayes. That name, he used to work at CBS News at 48 Hours, and then started a blog with Crime Cider, and then moved with me to the Weather Channel. And one of the biggest advices he ever gave me, or rather, just something to always live by, was that growth and comfort are never good bedfellows. You can't grow and be comfortable at the same time. If you're comfortable, you're not growing, and you're probably gonna be doing the same thing over and over again, and eventually in 10 years you find yourself in an obsolete environment. So to always be growing, but never to be afraid of being uncomfortable.
This one is a little bit more terrifying than anything. You're only as good as your last story, which means that, yes, your last story might have sucked, but you can keep going. Or this was a great story, but don't build your ego on it. Like, keep going, and that it's a constant journey of like a long road to continuous excellence, which is much harder than actually doing some opus that supposedly defines you. There's no such thing. That was like one of the nicest things, because it keeps you curious, it keeps you going, it keeps you trying harder.
Well, that's all fantastic advice. I'm excited for all of you to stay curious, and thank you so much for all your kind attention today and for all the speakers. It was a wonderful day, and we appreciate having you all here. Thank you.